to turn into love songs.
Good morning, everybody, and thanks for joining us for our webinar from the Well this morning, where we'll be discussing the prophetic voice of children and young people. For those who are new to Zoom webinar, this is a watch and listen situation. So unlike Zoom meetings, you won't be able to interact with your face or your voice, but you can interact using the chat function. If you want everybody to see what you're saying in chat, then you need to make sure you've selected all panelists and attendees. If you want to just talk to the people who are presenting, then just select panelists. You can also interact using the Q&A function, and hopefully later on in the webinar there will be a chance for me to put your questions to our panelists today. So please do send some questions our way using Q&A. My name's Lynn. I work for the Children, Youth and Family team as a development officer, and I'm going to be kind of hosting this webinar this morning. And I'm just going to invite our panelists to quickly introduce themselves now. So we'll start with Penny because she's unmuted.
Hi, I'm Penny Fuller from the coordinator of Children, Youth and Family team in the Connectional Children, Youth and Family team. I also volunteer each week in my own Methodist church and local Methodist church, and are involved in ministry with children and young people through that, in particular with the Girls Brigade.
Thanks, Penny. Chrissy, you're unmuted now, so you can go next.
Hi, I'm Chrissy Aindo, and I'm a recent graduate from Trinity College, Bristol and St Mellitus, South West.
Thanks so much, Chrissy. And Simon, last but not least, could you introduce yourself, please?
Hello, I'm Simon Sutcliffe. I'm a Learning and Development Officer for the Learning Network in the North Western Man region.
Brilliant, thank you. So the webinar today will be recorded and will be available on our Well Learning Hub YouTube channel later. So if you do miss anything or you want to watch it again, then please do catch up with it there. We're going to be together for an hour and a half today. There will be a comfort break partway through, so you'll get a chance to get yourself a drink or have a strategic break. And we're going to hope to have some time to answer some questions at the end. So again, just please do use that Q&A function if you've got some questions you want to put to the panelists. It might be helpful, and now's the moment to do it, to grab some pen and paper so that you can have that to hand to jot down what you think God might be saying to you or what resonates with you as we go through the next hour and a half. And the flow of the session will be that we'll have a presentation from each of our panelists, a short presentation, and then we're going to allow some moments for quiet reflection after that presentation, and then we're going to invite you to offer your reflections in chat in response to those presentations, and then, as I say, we'll end with a panel conversation. Matt, if you could just share the PowerPoint, that'd be really helpful, thank you, and then we can kind of talk you through the running order for the day. We're going to start our learning journey this morning with a Bible study, a Bible reflection on Samuel, the boy prophet. And then Penny's going to talk to us a little bit about how we create spaces for the prophetic voice of children and young people. And then we're going to move on. Thanks, Matt. We're going to move on to the role of the prophet, which Simon will be bringing to us. And then we're going to talk about children prophecy and being an agent of change. And then, as I say, we will finish with that opportunity to have a panel conversation. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Penny, who's going to lead us in our Bible reflection. Thanks.
Classic mistake. Matt, could you flick onto the next slide, please? Thank you. So our reading this morning is from the NIV, and it's where the Lord calls Samuel as a prophet, and it's 1 Samuel 3, verse 1 to 8. I'll start off by just reading the passage and then the verses, and then we'll go into some reflections with some questions and thoughts for you to just sort of reflect quietly on. The Lord calls Samuel to be a prophet. The boy Samuel ministered before the Lord under Eli. In those days, the word of the Lord was rare. There were not many visions. One night, Eli, whose eyes were becoming so weak that he could barely see, was lying down in his usual place. The lamp of God had not yet gone out, and Samuel was lying down in the house of the Lord where the ark of God was. Then the Lord called Samuel. Samuel answered, "Here I am." And he ran to Eli and said, "Here I am, you called me." But Eli said, "I did not call you. Go back and lie down." So he went and laid down again. Again the Lord called, "Samuel." And Samuel got up and went to Eli and said, "Here I am, you called me." "My son Eli," said, "I did not call. Go back and lie down." Now Samuel did not yet know the Lord. The word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him. A third time the Lord called, "Samuel." And Samuel got up and went to Eli and said, "Here I am, you called me." Then Eli realized that the Lord was calling the boy. So Eli told Samuel, "Go and lie down. And if he calls you, say, 'Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening.'" So Samuel went and lay down in his place. The Lord came and stood there, calling as at the other times, "Samuel, Samuel." Then Samuel said, "Speak, your servant is listening." And the Lord said to Samuel, "See, I'm about to do something in Israel that will make the ears of everyone who hears about it tingle. At that time I will carry out against Eli everything I spoke against his family from beginning to the end. For I told him that I would judge his family forever because of the sin he knew about. His sons blasphemed God, and he failed to restrain them. Therefore I swore to the house of Eli the guilt of Eli's house. The guilt of Eli's house will never be atoned by sacrifice or offering." Samuel lay down until morning, and then opened the doors of the house of the Lord. He was afraid to tell Eli the vision. But Eli called him and said, "Samuel, my son." Samuel answered, "Here I am." "What was it he said to you?" Eli asked. "Do not hide it from me. May God deal with you, be it ever so severely, if you hide from me anything he told you." So Samuel told him everything, hiding nothing from him. Then Eli said, "He is the Lord. Let him do what is good in his eyes." Just move the slide for me, please, Matt. So who was Eli? He was a Jewish priest living in the days of the judges and serving God at the tabernacle in Shiloh. Eli is best remembered for his blessing on Samuel's mother Hannah and for his part in Samuel's first prophecy. Eli had two sons, Hophni and Phinehas. They also served in the tabernacle and were not very well behaved. And who was Samuel? Samuel was a boy aged 12, possibly early teens. He was dedicated to the tabernacle by his mother Hannah, lived in the tabernacle, was mentored and taught by Eli the priest, and had not yet found faith or had a personal experience of God. We hear that in the reading. Matt, could you just move the slide on for me? As we go through just reflecting on the Bible study, our focus this morning is about children as prophets and how we hear and create spaces to listen to them and enable them to experience as Samuel did. And I have two images here that I just would like you just to reflect on before we move further. The first one is from Chloe, who is 9, and these are taken from a competition run by the National RE Education Council and each year called Spirited Arts. And I'll just give you a little bit of time just to read the slide and then we'll move to the second image. Matt, could you move on to the next one, please? So in 1 Samuel 3, we hear the Lord's call of Samuel to be a prophet. As I say, he was 12 years old and been a servant in the temple since he was 4 years old when his mother Hannah took him there. A prophet, by definition, is one who speaks for God to the people offering challenge. Samuel was called by God to be a prophetic, and God was communicating with this child and asking him to be a deliverer of a big message to a prominent church leader. And it was a challenging message, an unhappy message for the recipient to hear. God said to Samuel, "I'm about to do something in Israel that will make the ears of everyone who hears about it tingle." When has what a child said to you made your ears tingle? Verse 7 tells us that Samuel did not yet know the Lord. The word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him. At this time, Samuel did not yet know God in a personal way. Do we recognise that God chose and chooses to speak to children and give them a message for us, and in particular in this context, a child who did not have a personal relationship or experience of God? What does this say to us in the church? Eli, an adult with a leadership role in the church, really listened to Samuel. He didn't placate or dismiss Samuel. He engaged in dialogue and gave him good advice. Eli told Samuel, "Go back and say, 'Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening.'" He was not to ask the Lord, "Please give me my heart's desire," or "Help me with my problems, Lord," or "Pray for your pet." No, Samuel was to say, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." The Hebrew word used in the scripture here for listening means to hear with a view of obeying. So how do we facilitate and enable this prayer stance with children? Listen for God with an expectation that God will speak, and then be prepared to obey. God recognises Samuel's spiritual gifts and calls him to recognise them and respond. Eli, although not a good priest or perfect in his ministry, also recognises that God has called Samuel and empowers and instructs him to listen. And afterwards he calls him to account, to deliver the message, even though it was difficult. And Eli did expect it to be difficult. Samuel goes on to live a lifetime of listening, responding to God's call and responding in action. And his mentor created a space that enabled him to do that. The message that God asked Samuel to deliver to Eli was not an easy one. What challenges does this raise for us in the church in recognising that God speaks to and through children? Let us just take some time to pray. Lord, we respond to your call to be Eli's in our approach to ministry with and amongst children. We give over to you our time, our calling, and our response to this vocation. Amen. Matt, I wonder whether you would move on to the next slide. So now we move into our first part of our reflections this morning, which follow on from our Bible reflection with Eli and Samuel. So how do we create spaces for the prophetic voice of children to emerge and be heard through spirituality and faith formation? And I'm going to try and unpack that a little bit by first of all just giving a little bit of sort of background about children and how they speak, which you'll be well aware of, then going into a little bit about some faith formation sort of approaches, and then some sort of key elements to reflect on really. So So how do we in our ministry purposely provide the settings that enable us to recognise children as prophets? Well, we can offer settings that are intentionally nurturing and formational to children as spiritual beings, recognising them as theologians in themselves, prophets, disciples, and worshippers of God. We can provide a community that offers peer and intergenerational learning opportunities, to be in dialogue with children where we learn from each other. We can show willing to journey with them as fellow travellers and co-learners, pilgrims together, not teacher and child. And we can create spaces and facilitate a balance between informational ministry and formational ministry that has our traditions, rhythms and rituals embedded in the flow. Just want you to take a few moments to reflect. What have you learned that has deepened your faith from the children you are in ministry with? What are our traditions, rituals and rhythms in Methodism? As you'll have experienced in your ministry, children have an innate connection with God through their vulnerability and openness, their acceptance of mystery and awe and wonder. They readily recognise God's presence all around them. And if you think about the children in the programme a few years back in Outnumbered, you know, who were very open about talking about their experiences in life and would very openly tell their parents about their parenting skills and what they thought about the world. Children are receivers. They have no difficulty expressing their needs and accepting their dependence, but they also want to be in conversation with us and to have independence, to take on roles and responsibility on their own, as well as with us, take action, you know, together. Children love what is real stories from real life, engaging with experiences that enhance their awareness of life. They haven't yet put on masks of cultural niceties and rationalisation that we as adults inhabit. They want to take risks, challenge and ask questions, and that can be scary for us. I had a friend who's moved into a new house and put a rope swing on a tree, and she says, I've put those rope strings on the tree, but they are so dangerous, I'm really worried about them. And yeah, all their children wanted to do was to climb to the top of the rope swing and just fall backwards. And I said to her, you know, the tree is strong and the rope swing is designed to let them do that. Matt, would you just mind moving the slide on for me, please? So ministry with and amongst children generally has two approaches. An informational approach where we teach children about God in the hopes of leading them to develop a relationship with God. We create programs packed with activities and a progression of content that introduces new material in stages, often telling children the answers. Or a formational approach. This is a process rather than a program, nurturing the relationship children have with God so they can more easily take in information about God from the Bible and church traditions. It focuses on the experiences the child brings to the community and the dialogue the child has with God through their spiritual practices. The practice of spiritual disciplines remains constant, but the individual is ever changing, growing. Both of these approaches are important in a child's life and important in our ministry. But often we provide children with so much information and so many answers that we fail to call forth the answers within. An informational approach, children often learn to be good, to give the right answer rather than becoming aware of God and being able to say where they see God and developing an ever deeper relationship with God. I'd like you again to take a few seconds just to reflect on your ministry with and amongst children. Is it balanced between informational approach and formational? Or does it have an element of both approaches, or just one of the approaches? So how do we create spaces to purposely provide the settings that enable us to recognise children as prophets? We do need a formational approach in these spaces with and amongst children, one that enables them to learn and practice spiritual disciplines, and to know and understand our faith heritage, and be comfortable with the ritual and rhythm of spiritual practices. A Methodist way of life, really. A space that enables children to listen for God, an Eli and Samuel space. An opportunity to talk regularly about God and about God's presence in their lives, and share their story of living out their discipleship in both peer settings and with children and adults in good dialogue sharing together. You know, where you sit round together, you have conversations, and you think and you ask questions, and you just wonder about what's going on and where is God in it. Giving children the opportunity to be companions in Christ with us, to be heard and be in conversation with adults and peers who listen with heart, mind and soul, who don't necessarily come with a preset agenda, but we have an open space to just say, where is God? And what is God saying to us? Matt, could you just move the slide on, please? So what are the key elements for creating an environment for nurturing spiritual practicing and recognising children as prophetic voices? So some time in our sessions for silence, solitude and quiet. Sometimes we're a little bit afraid of this. Time for imagination, for space, for awe and wonder and play. Time for peace, reverence and respect for each other. Sacred space and the world, recognising that sacred space and naming it. Understanding of spiritual disciplines, when and how they fit into sessions and worship. For example, you know, if you were having a love feast, you know, sort of naming, actually this is similar to the sacrament of communion, where we sit and we share our stories, we make a commitment to God, we share food together, we break bread. Understanding the role of a leader, families, the church leadership and congregations in this process of being companions in Christ. Not just a culture where the spiritual formation rests with us solely as children's workers or those involved in ministry with children. So it's a whole church community responsibility to nurture this, a whole church responsibility to be Eli. Opportunities for peer time and intergenerational learning and activity. So, you know, the temptation is sometimes to either do all peers together or go all intergenerational, but actually we need to have both of those things in our community time together to build that kind of formational approach. And it's not just about games and fun, but it's about story sharing, real conversation about life. What's happened this week? Where have you seen God? Where have you heard God? Where has it been difficult? Just as much as joy, where do you see joy and how do you experience joy? Matt, could you flick the slide on, please? So what is our role as facilitator in creating these spaces or being a leader in these spaces? I think actually it's changing our outlook from teacher with answers to pilgrims and companions on a journey with children, companions in Christ together, and that we learn from each other in that space. And creating formational groups that learn together in peer and intergenerational groups, rather than teaching a class. So the opportunity to recognise sacred space, to be in ritual and rhythm, as well as playing together. Mike, could you move the slide on, please? So what are the characteristics of this sort of leadership? Well, there's listening skills. As in Eli told Samuel, go listen to God. Spiritual formation groups are process orientating, using a rhythm of spiritual practices to explore listening to one another and God, leaving space for God to fill the quiet rather than consistently filling the space ourselves with voices. It's about patience, to let things unfold in their own time, When we ask a question, we don't have to have an answer, and that can be really scary. It's about acceptance, accepting children as they are, and model this, even if they're distracted in the sessions. Leave things open-ended and not worrying about that. We're not teaching a point, but in engaging in a process of discovery. And within that, we'll find answers. It's a partnering with adults and children, families, church leadership, and congregations in dialogue together, and involving children in this conversation and being together. So just to finish with, Matt, could you move the slide on, please? So what are the key elements and the key points? Develop a formational approach in building these relationships. Invite those in leadership along for a Zoom coffee to explain the approach and your expectations of their support in enabling this process of spiritual formation and accompanying children. You're not in it on your own. Get the whole church and congregation behind you, the whole community. Talk about what does this mean for us. Nurture an understanding of spiritual development and faith formation. So what does that mean for me as an individual, as well as my church family, as well as the children that we're with and alongside? Talk about and create an awareness of spiritual and spiritual disciplines and the importance of nurturing children's spirituality as a whole and taking it as a whole congregation's responsibility. And I think within that, it's actually recognising what's the importance in our own spirituality. What do we need within this? And how do we learn from children as well as them learning from us? And a few key writers, I think, just to think about within this on faith formation and spiritual development are Jerome Berryman, who's the developer and from Godly Play Practices, Rebecca Nye, John Westerhoff, Joyce Ann Mercer. And I think later on we'll give some more sort of resources and things to sort of share. But I think a good starting point is, where is God for me? Where do I see God? And how do I sit down with children and explore that together? Thank you, Lynn.
Thanks, Penny. As we said at the start, we're going to allow just a few moments now of quiet reflection. So we're just going to sit in quiet just for a few moments and allow you to kind of think about what resonated for you, what you noticed in what Penny's just presented. And we'd now like to invite you to respond as well. So if you have just some reflections or something you've noticed or something that perhaps even God's been saying to you that you'd like to share in the chat, then please do. As I said at the start, if you want everybody to see that, then please make sure you've marked it as for the attention of all panelists and attendees. If you have a question that you'd like to be captured for the panel conversation later, then please put that in Q&A. So just a couple of minutes now to offer some responses, and if you have any, then some questions as well. Thanks, Helena, and thanks, Brian, for being the first out the post. So Helen is saying that godly play works really well, as indeed it does. And not just with children as well. I've seen it work quite well with intergenerational groups. And Brian's recommending the We Do God research by Youthscape. We'll make sure we capture everything that's put in chat, particularly people post resources or pieces of reading, and share that as part of the information that goes with the YouTube video, including those books that Penny recommended. Brilliant, thank you, Simon. Just a few more seconds to capture feedback. Penny, I think you're on mute if you're trying to say something.
Sorry, Lynn, I forgot that.
Okay.
I think the godly play principles, even if you don't practice full godly play, and actually probably godly play would strike me down for saying that, but the godly play principles are useful, a very useful tool. And yes, Brian, I think, you know, the experiential faith formation is, you know, absolutely essential in developing those formational groupings.
And Sue makes a very good point about silence being nerve-wracking, especially when you're waiting for people to respond to your webinar presentations. So, thank you, Sue.
Yeah, but I've just been speaking an awful lot about just creating spaces to let God be.
Yeah.
So, you know, practice what you preach.
Open to not having the answers. That's very true, Fiona. It's very difficult. Okay, thank you so much for that, and thank you. Quaker practice is definitely there's a lot we can learn from our Quaker brothers and sisters, isn't there? I'm going to hand over to Simon now, who's going to talk to us for a little bit about the role of the prophet, and again we'll do the same, inviting comments and reflections after Simon's spoken to us.
Thanks, Lynn. It's great to be with you all. I need to fess up early on and say that I'm not really an expert on children and young people and working with children and young people. I did work, I was a youth worker when I used to have hair, but those days have long gone. And my role now tends to be more around theological education and teaching. And so I'm going to come to you from that place as a theologian, as somebody who's interested in thinking theologically about what it means to be a prophet. And I'm hoping what we can do, I'm going to share my screen with you. I'm hoping that what we can do then is begin to make some connections between what we think a prophet might be and how that might work with our children and young people. So here, what I'm really interested in is the utterances, the speaking of children and young people into the church. That's what I'm kind of addressing in this next couple of minutes. And my conversation partner is Walter Brueggemann, who I would recommend to anybody who wants to read anything around the Old Testament. Walter Brueggemann's an American, both a pastor and a theologian, and he has a particular take of reading the Old Testament, which I think is really helpful to us today. And this is one of his books, The Prophetic Imagination. And in this book, he sets up a scene between Moses and Pharaoh, and Moses is his key ally in this book. And it's interesting that he sees Moses as the prophet, when often we see Moses as the giver of the law. But here he really wants to drive Moses as the prophet. And this is particularly around how Moses tackles Pharaoh in that Old Testament story. And so he says, Brueggemann says, the task of prophetic ministry is to nurture, nourish, and evoke a consciousness and perception alternative to the consciousness and perception of the dominant culture around us. That's no easy task. I mean, if that's the job description of a prophet, then who would be one by choice? But let's put this into then the context of our children and young people in the church. It then raises the question, if we want to say that our children are prophetic, then how do children and young people evoke an alternative consciousness for us in the church? And in what way do they challenge the perception of the dominant cultures around us? Now, I would argue that being a prophet is not the easiest or even the safest of occupations within a community. And so there's a real question about what happens. So Penny was talking earlier about the rope swing and the tree and the kind of the ability of our young people and children to take risk and to move into those spaces. And what happens when our young people and children take risk and say, this is an alternative to the way in which you have been thinking, to the way in which we have considered this for time immemorial? What happens when young people and children offer us a new way of, not just a new way of thinking, but a new way of being in the world? So that's what Brueggemann is asking us in this first question, in this first quote. I'm going to move to another book of Brueggemann's. So he writes a book a week, I think. So there's plenty of him to read out there, and nearly always around the Old Testament. And so his next book is this huge, big tome called The Theology of the Old Testament. You can see how big it is because this is a quote from page 624, and it's not even the end of the book. But he's talking here about the nature of the prophet again. And so they is the prophet in this quote. So here's what he writes. They, the prophet, characteristically perceive their time and place as a circumstance of crisis, a context in which dangers are great and life or death decisions must be made. He likes to build up the hyperbole, does Brueggemann. Or perhaps it is better to say that the appearance and utterance of the prophets evokes a crisis circumstance where none has been perceived previously. That is, the prophets not only respond to crisis, but by their abrupt utterance, they generate crisis. This is a really important thing. And now I speak as a father. I know that children and young people can generate crisis. I've experienced crisis from children and young people of my own in a particular way. But here, Brueggemann's not talking just about the crisis of they tell you at 5 o'clock in the morning that they need £12 worth of art equipment in the next hour to take to school with them. That's not the crisis he's speaking of here. What he's speaking of here is the crisis that they utter, their proclamation, their speaking into the world of an alternative consciousness generates a new situation in which we have to then think differently, and it will be panicky and crisis-like. In our conversations within the panelists, and as we've been planning this, Greta Thunberg's come up in a lot of our thinking and a lot of our talking, and it might come up again when Chrissy introduces some of her work. But I think you can see there a prophet who speaks, who wants to provoke an alternative consciousness, and by her speaking generates another crisis. Now, the crisis might have already existed, in that the crisis existed in the world, in planet degradation and in the harm and damage that we're doing to creation. But by her speaking then creates another set of crises. And we see this crisis because then other people, mainly adults, mainly white male adults, want to be able to say to Greta, we don't like what you're saying because we heard that you caught an Uber the other day. We don't like you saying because we heard that you, or we refuse to listen to what you're saying because you should be at school learning rather than talking to us in an angry manner. So her crisis, she speaks from a crisis and then generates a new crisis. So the question, how do children and young people evoke, not just speak from, but evoke a crisis in the church? And my final slide goes back to Brueggemann's first book on prophetic imagination. And this is what I think is really difficult for any prophet, but particularly for our children and young people. And you see it again in Greta Thunberg, but you see it in other places too. So Brueggemann writes, I believe that the proper idiom for the prophet in cutting through the royal numbness. So remember, when he's talking about royal numbness, he's talking about Pharaoh in this prophetic imagination. Pharaoh is the royal numbness and denial is the language of grief. The rhetoric that engages the community in the mourning for a funeral they do not want to admit. It is indeed their own funeral. What does he mean by this? He's speaking here that the institutions, and here he's talking about Pharaoh, they want to create for us a system in which it keeps us in denial of the real pain and harm that's going on around us. And so we can find all sorts of different ways in which that happens. So, for instance, we'll keep on the issue of climate change and in the environment. Big oil companies who set up charities to plant trees, which is great, and we all want to plant more trees, but actually they need to stop doing the other stuff that they're doing in the first place that generates the income for them to plant trees for charity. And so what we do is we just see that piece of work, we think, well, at least they're doing something. And that's what Brueggemann would mean by the numbness and the denial. It just keeps us all just a little bit at bay from what we're hearing. But, Brueggemann says, if you speak the language of grief into this, then it is difficult then to hear, because it reminds us of the mourning, of the funeral that we don't want to admit to. Now, I think this has so much resonance for the church today, and so much resonance for the way in which our children and young people might speak into us today. That might want to say, you do realise that the very practices that you practice might be the very things that are killing us. Imagine that. The language of grief. So my other question is, what is the language of grief that children and young people speak to us in the church? So 3 questions to reflect on, which I haven't put up, so you feel free to write them down. How do children and young people evoke an alternative consciousness in the church? How do children and young people evoke crisis in the church? And what is the language of grief that children and young people speak to us? Thank you.
Sorry, we're going to go into a few moments of reflection again, and hopefully I've captured a summary of Simon's questions there as well, if that helps you with your few moments of reflection. Thanks. And as before, we're going to invite you to offer your reflections in chat, or your questions for the panel for later in the Q&A function. So please do just share what's coming up for you at the moment. Thank you, Brian. That's really profound. Got another minute for anybody who wants to add their comments or reflections. Wow, they're coming in thick and fast now. Wanted the church to be more loving on a previous 3-Gen manifesto, thank you. Yeah. Children better at highlighting inconsistencies. Mm-hmm. Thank you, Louise, who is listening and hearing. Thank you so much, everybody, for offering those comments. As I say, we will capture what is put in chat and make sure we share that. Yeah, and they certainly challenge with their openness and enthusiasm. It's that's a positive point, which is really good, because sometimes we can get a little bit discouraged. So thank you for that, Anne. We're going to have a comfort break now, because we're very aware that we've thrown a lot of thinking and information at you already. So we're going to give you 5 minutes just to kind of stretch your legs, pour yourself a drink, take some time to just sit back and think about the stuff that we've already shared. Matt is going to put a timer up on the screen so that you know how long you've got on that break, and then we'll be back just after 11:30 to finish off. Thanks very much, everybody. Hello and welcome back. I hope you had a good break. We're going to go straight on now to hand over to Chrissy, who's going to talk to us a little bit about being prophets and being agents of change. Thanks, Chrissy.
Thank you. I don't know about anyone else, but my ears are quite tingly after listening to all of these things. It's been great. I really enjoyed it. So yeah, I've been thinking about prophets in general and agents of change, activists, change makers, and how they are almost interchangeable with each other. So in this little section, I'm going to talk about the similarities and differences of Old Testament prophets and change makers and the message they deliver. There will be a few Bible verses I'm not going to quote, but I'll reference them in case you want to look them up later. So right now, maybe imagine an Old Testament prophet and also a change maker or an activist. So you might conjure up Jeremiah or Jonah, Ezekiel, Isaiah. There's quite a few to choose from. Or perhaps Martin Luther King, Greta Thunberg, Extinction Rebellion, Krish Kandiah from Home for Good, Sojourner Truth, Rosa Parks, suffragettes. Again, the list goes on and on and on. So as we think about prophets and change makers, think about whether their titles can be interchangeable. I personally think that the role of change maker and prophet are not really that different to each other. And I think it's important to recognise this, because we often think of prophets as the voice of God and change makers and activists as the voice of humanity. Whereas I believe there are a few more nuances between them, and both have the potential to reveal the will of God to at least some degree. We live in a world where we are bombarded with messages, audible, visual, moving, static. It can be hard to know which voices we should attend to, which voices are legitimate and have authority, and which voices just desire our attention to meet their own needs. In our current society, change makers and activists make their voice heard in order to convince people of a new direction and bring about change in society, both in the areas of equality and social change and the environment. The voices they follow are those of scientists who have warned of catastrophe if their words are not heeded, and those who illustrate inequality within humanity and society. They see a world that is damaged through the actions of humanity and through structures that are not designed to protect the vulnerable. They articulate that humanity needs to change direction to prevent potentially irreversible damage to the planet due to environmental disregard and for human relationships to be able to establish equality and dignity. They recognise the damage that has already been done and communicate that the continued trajectory is not sustainable or ethical, and the unjust treatment of fellow creatures is unacceptable. Changemakers are needed today to make humanity aware of the consequences of their behaviour and what to do to change direction. This work, however, is not a new phenomenon. The message that change is necessary is repeated generation after generation and is seen in scripture through the prophets. Prophets were the voices who called for change and foretold disaster if their warnings were not heeded. They had a God-given insight to communicate that the people were not living in a way that glorified God and did not protect the vulnerable in their society. The prophets were needed to draw attention through a variety of mediums to the problem of turning away from God and the consequences of their actions, and to remind the people of their responsibility to their neighbour. We see this in Micah 6 verse 8 and Jeremiah 7, 2-8. So to help us recognise changemakers as having a prophetic voice, I'm just going to give a quick recap on what Old Testament prophets did. Old Testament prophets gave messages to a particular context, yet they are still messages that resonate throughout history. The messages are timeless and remain relevant to different historical and social situations, as well as ethical concerns. They had a message of restoring justice and returning back to God. The people were told to turn away from their wrongdoing and back to their covenant with God. The prophets were not only spokespeople for God, called to instigate change, but they also spoke for those without a voice, the underprivileged, forgotten, the poor, and the victims of injustice, which sounds quite a lot like a changemaker or activist. The Old Testament prophets were an eclectic group of individuals. They came from different social backgrounds, different ages, different gender, experiences, again, much like our changemakers and activists today. But they held in common a belief that God had given them a message that they were compelled to share, a message that reprimanded God's people of Israel from turning away from God and not following the laws of loving God with all their hearts and not loving their neighbour. Deuteronomy 6 verse 5, Leviticus 19 verse 34. The consequence of turning away from God resulted in God calling for a change of ways, a message delivered through the voice and actions of the prophets. The prophets were required to challenge the lack of holiness of the people, as well as the social concerns that were neglected. And as a result, the prophets are associated with social justice. The consequence of not obeying resulted in the devastation of society. By not following the laws, the poor, the orphans, and the widows suffered. Obedient living allowed communities to care for each other more effectively. The job of a prophet was hard. Although they had authority from God to challenge situations and predict judgment or salvation, they also felt the weight of responsibility for the outcome of restoring the people to a relationship with God. Again, we see this echoed in changemakers and the responsibility they feel to generate change. The words and actions of Old Testament prophets help us today to discern the prophetic voice of others. They remind us that prophets and changemakers come in all shapes and sizes. Their status is not significant, but their message being discerned is. Listening to the message is important. And the prophets give us this template for discerning God's call, the message, and the implications. So in scripture, prophets brought warnings of disaster if social action for justice and a turn back to God did not occur, and promises of redemption. Amos chapter 5, verse 10-18, and Isaiah 1, 16-20. The prophetic message required action from its audience to enable change to happen. Again, much like the message of changemakers. It's not just for one person to do, it's a collective response. But changemakers are distinct from prophets in that they do not necessarily claim to speak on behalf of God or call people to turn back to God. They do, whether acting from a faith perspective or not, however, discern where humanity has failed in keeping God's covenant. They bring awareness to situations that people have not or have not wanted to recognise. They recognise that society has become complacent and comfortable, and they take action to challenge the status quo. Their actions generate news coverage and attention. For example, Greta Thunberg and Extinction Rebellion draw the world's attention to the issues of climate change through extreme action and disrupt the daily lives of those they encounter. Historically, we've seen activists campaign for, amongst others, the rights of women, race equality, civil rights, debt cancellation, and environmental issues. Their activism has made a difference, but we can all see, I'm sure, that there is still much to do in relation to those issues. On a smaller scale, individuals choose to purchase products from ethical companies rather than companies who are reported to exploit their workers, such as particular brands of chocolate. Changemakers and prophets recognise that a transformation of the people is required for change to happen. And despite changemakers not necessarily claiming to speak for God, they recognise issues that need addressing and take action to bring about change. Prophets were concerned with the lack of holiness amongst the people, as well as a change towards social justice. And a changed people, by default, should bring about a changed attitude. We heard how Samuel did not know God in a personal way when he was called by God to deliver a very awkward message. Yet he still listened and obeyed, and Eli listened to what Samuel said. God still gave the job to Samuel. This suggests that God does not wait for someone to be in a covenant with him, but calls those who are taking notice and listening. Prophets and changemakers both have this insight into observing where change is needed, and the creativity and courage to respond and speak out. Changemakers seek to create change in attitudes within society and social structures. They seek to bring equality and justice to situations where it has been lacking, and draw attention to the world issues that cause both harm to humanity and the planet. At times, this results in violence and civil disobedience, which influences society's reaction to their cause, with some believing it's necessary action and others believing that violence is never the answer. What starts as peaceful action can erupt into what is extreme. The frustration of being unseen and unheard becomes uncontainable. When we don't listen to children and young people, do they then feel unseen and unheard? Is there a risk that they will take extreme action to be heard, or will they instead begin to disconnect from God and find themselves heard elsewhere? Prophets and changemakers both open our eyes to our responsibility to care about creation, to love our neighbour, to demand justice in our social structures, and to play our part. By attending to the voices and actions of changemakers and prophets, whoever they are, and recognising their joint purpose, discerning their message, we can all take action and live more prophetically ourselves. We don't necessarily need to be prophets, but we can live prophetically. Through running children's groups, youth work, we give young people the opportunity to flourish and find their purpose in a space curated for them. Walking instead of driving will help the planet. Joining a campaign, fostering or supporting a fostering family, adoption, doing things that care for the planet and our neighbours, and turning towards God in our lives. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Chrissy. Yet again, we're going to give you a few moments to reflect on what Chrissy's presented to us. Please do take some time to think about what God might have been saying during that segment. And as before, we're going to invite you to offer some reflections or comments in the chat, and any questions that you have for the panel in the Q&A. We are going to move into a panel conversation later, straight after this. So if you have questions that you'd like to put to the panel, now's the time to share those as well. Thanks. Yeah, definitely. Thank you very much, Joanne, for being the first out the gate this time. Thank you. They definitely do need some support and encouragement. Mm-hmm. That's great. Thank you, Simon. I think part of the work we're trying to do through the Agents of Change stuff is helping children and young people to link the social justice issues that they care about to their faith and kind of make those links for themselves. Yeah, thank you very much, Sue. Yeah. That was one of the things I noticed in what Chrissy was saying, that idea that if children and young people aren't listened to, that they might go elsewhere. So thank you for highlighting that. And Brian's reminding us of that experiential experience of God as well through social action too, which is really important. Feel free to keep sharing reflections, but we're going to move into a conversation now between the panel. So if the panel can unmute themselves, that would be really great. We did have a question that came in after Penny's presentation, and I hope Pamela doesn't mind me kind of sharing it, because I think it's a really good starting point for conversation. And she asked how we encourage congregations to see children as having their own role in the church body. I think that's a really important question, so I thought I'd offer that first. And hope that Pamela didn't mind. So, and hope the panel don't mind that that's the one I'm offering to them first, if they have any thoughts on that.
I think it is about scratching right back to the beginning on what it means to be in a space together and have dialogue. I think often we sort of, and getting to know each other, you know, that sort of creating opportunities for mentoring and modelling together. But also talking together, and then things will come out of that when people get to know each other, when adults become confident with children, because sometimes, you know, adults can be scared of children because they are honest. And but also we take it, I think when we work in ministry with children and people, we take it for granted about understanding that good dialogue with children, that we know we see them eye to eye and we talk to them in a balanced and equitable way. But a lot of people are afraid of that. They're not often used to understanding the dynamics between that. So I think, you know, creating opportunities where children and adults are around together and learning together and talking together, then getting that then leads into involvement in other roles, or creating mentoring opportunities, you know, where children, young people are shadowing, working together with adults, taking action, doing social action, as Brian says, together. You know, children say, we can do this on our own, we can do this independently, but actually we want to do it together, and creating those opportunities.
Thanks, Penny. Chrissy or Simon, do you have anything to add? I think Simon was...
I've got one thing, which is, so one of the other fascinating things about the prophets is that they're nearly all men. And there are 5 female prophets mentioned in the Old Testament. And there's a couple of feminist scholars that have done some work around why was it that these 5 got named in an occupation that was run by men. And one of the things that they point out is that when these women emerged as prophets was a time when socially and culturally the temple had been destroyed. So all the main sites had gone and faith moved into a more domestic space. And that's when those domestic spaces had more power. And when they had more power, the women who were able to speak into that. So one of the questions about when can we allow children, how do we help children to speak? Actually, some of it might be around, if that's true. When will the cultural context be appropriate that means that we have no choice but to listen to children and young people. And so, you know, as a Christian, I'm kind of putting that on God a bit and saying, actually, how will you help us get into such a mess that we will only then listen to our children and young people and say, thank God for them, and in that kind of way. But some of it is around, you know, whilst we continue to practice the way we practice, to continue to be the way we be, then we will always find, children will always find it difficult to have a voice in that role, in the same way that female prophets did in the Old Testament. So there's a kind of contextual shift that needs to happen for us, I think.
I think also as adults, we sometimes feel like we've been there, done that. So when you were talking about crisis, Simon, it made me think, are some of us of a certain age a bit crisis fatigued? We've kind of gone through Live Aid, thought we were going to change the world and didn't. So then when children come to us with their new ideas and their prophetic voice, we kind of feel like we failed perhaps in our own lives to do that, and unintentionally perhaps then squash children and say it won't make a difference because we've tried it before.
Absolutely.
So true.
Yeah, we don't want to hear that crisis.
Yeah, that ties in with activism fatigue as well, doesn't it? I guess. Yeah. So we have had a question come in on Q&A. That's exciting. So it's I think building on what you've just been talking about. So how can we encourage the whole church to listen to the voice of children and young people, and it not just be lip service? So we're actually listening, but we're also acting on it. I think I'll also kind of throw a question at the panel and hope again that they don't mind, as to whether or not we actually listen to the prophetic voice of anybody in the church, let alone children and young people. Do we actually truly believe in a prophetic voice and pay attention to that isn't just lip service? And how do we perhaps encourage that as a culture?
The question of enabling the whole church. So here's something that I'd not quite anticipated when I started doing some work around prophets. And Chrissy's probably picked this up in her work already, but one of the things that I found quite unnerving was that I always thought prophetic spoke from the edges into the middle, is what I always thought. But there's quite a number of Old Testament scholars who would say, actually, the prophets were and Brueggemann would say, they're a child of the tradition. They're fully kind of, you know, they know their tradition. They know, that's why they know what God is speaking to them. And there's a couple who said, very few prophets, there's some that got killed, Jesus being the main one, of course, but there are some that got killed, but very few did. And that's partly because they were protected by the community, actually. I spoke about this around Nelson Mandela, and somebody, a white South African said to me, Nelson Mandela should have died. They should have got rid of him, but they couldn't get rid of him because he was protected essentially by his community. He would have caused more harm to get rid of him than it would have done to just put him into prison. And in that sense, the prophets were part of the community and held by the community and protected by the community, even though they were saying things that the community didn't like. So part of the question for the whole church is, how do we hold our children and young people, even when they say things that we don't like, in order that they can have a space that then is protected? And I think it goes back to the stuff that Penny was saying right at the beginning, really, about finding those spaces where we can then hold them. But then that will be true for other people. So rather than people speaking from the edge to the center, I think they speak from the center back to this, from the center to the center. But they are the people who you wouldn't expect to be speaking. That's the key to it, in that sense. They're the people that you wouldn't expect. And so one of my questions around anybody in the church is, look out for the John the Baptists, the ones that look a bit weird, that are doing weird stuff. Because the likelihood is that they're the ones that God is speaking through.
Thanks, Simon. Penny and Chrissy, do you have any thoughts you'd like to offer on that one?
I think that covered it for me.
Me too, actually. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Simon.
I think then there's a lot of questions around. I mean, Tiers and Brian, they've raised questions about the whole church and the whole body of Christ. Sort of hearing the voice and what happens if they haven't got any children in that context. And I think that goes back to what Simon was saying about, you know, the shift to domestic context. there will be children in their lives, but there's also an onus on us, I think, as a church, to understand the full breadth of humanity and to talk the language of that, the same way as in Black Lives Matters, in feminism, in recognising children. We need to be naming that, even if that isn't in that space, and talking about it and talking of children, and sort of raising, actually, where am I going to hear this voice in society, even if it's not next to me in the pew or the seat? Where am I going to hear this in society? What do I reflect on this rising amount of children and young people who are speaking out? I mean, even at conference this year, a Methodist conference, one of the 3 Generate youth reps, very passionate about climate change and activism, got up and spoke into the debate around fossil fuels, the report that came this year to conference, and said, and very, articulated very well, actually we should stop now, because the proposal was to sort of pull out and get in line with the global regulations, but pull out slowly. And conference voted to pull out. Now that has a huge financial impact on the church by doing that. But what it did then create was the committee that was involved with that then invited that young person around the table and said, we need children and young people around this table to continue this conversation so that we can hear them, they can hear us, we can be in good dialogue, and we can take action together, which is a really powerful thing. So I think what my point would be is about, well, we need to find the language to be able to talk about those that are missing, just as much of those that are around. And in our spaces, we need to bring those people into them.
I think there's probably going to be some good stuff coming out of Evangelism and Growth and their team, and the stuff they're doing around mission planning as well. And in thinking about how we kind of take our mission planning and our kind of consultation and our big dreaming beyond just the people in the pews, as you say, but listening to the voices in the communities around us as well. I have a question here from Fiona, who asks how we make sure we don't just turn into another social justice organisation. We grasp for other matters, and perhaps we're in danger of losing our focus on God. How do we guard against this? How do we make disciples of all men, which is obviously the Great Commission, and women. So I wonder if, sorry to put you on the spot, I just wondered if Chrissy had some thoughts on that, because obviously she's been doing a lot of thinking around activism and prophecy and how the two sit together, but obviously it's open to the whole panel. Thank you.
So I would say, I think that it's okay if it just becomes another social action project, because if you've got people of faith working in it alongside those that don't have faith, then naturally your conversation will be about God as well as all the normal things of life or different things of life. You're not just going to be talking about the social action project, because if God is important to you, then that's going to reflect in how you talk and communicate, and it will just be part of your journeying together. It might not be a big God project in the way that we might traditionally think, but the change will happen. They'd have built those relationships with you, and I think they'll just naturally be curious to find out why you're involved in that project. Is it just because of your faith, or is it because you're passionate about that particular cause as well? That makes sense. I think it's that relationship. I think often faith is more, and sharing our faith is more about relationships than what group you might attend or what program you might be following or what church you go to. It's the relationship and journeying together.
I think it's also, as I was talking about earlier as well, Chris, I think it's built on that sort of understanding of our rituals and rhythm, and our heritage and practice, and and part of the Methodist way of life, and the commitment to serving in our community, and always bringing into that, and the learning and caring, but always bringing into that, where is God? Where have I seen God? And the story sharing and the rhythm of that, creating a rhythm of having that conversation in what we're doing. So I might be doing this action, but actually I'm doing this action because of how an outpouring of my discipleship. I'm asking where God is in that, and where I see God, and I'm sharing the story of my experience within that and the stories of others people's experiences within that too, and bringing that rhythm into that. And sometimes we put the rhythm over here and the talk of God over here and the action here. So, you know, in our ministry, whatever, we would start with actions and games and things like that, you know, and an activity, but sometimes forget to throw through that, you know, well, where is God? Where's my story this week? Where have I seen God? Where would God be in this? And what is God saying? And just leaving the silences for that to come through.
Yeah, I think all of that is exactly where I want to kind of locate myself, and but I'm interested as well in where we get those questions around about losing the faithfulness of the church, and where that kind of comes from, and I think there's something around the nature, what we have decided mission is, and what we've decided God is in that. And that is to do with, you know, we've tended to think, even though we don't explicitly say this, it goes God, church, world. So God speaks to the church and the church speaks to the world. But if God is in the world, then God might speak to the church from the world. So I would argue that God has spoken to the world in order to help the church to be better at enabling women to be in leadership roles in the church. Mm-hmm. God has spoken to the world in order to help the church to be better at dealing with its own institutional racism and its own ways of dealing with people of colour and working with people of colour. And so God has used the world for that and come this way around. Mm-hmm. So this idea that so the question is whether or not we will remain true to our I used to be a pioneer minister, so I worked a lot with non-Christians, and I used to talk about, or we belong to an ancient order, you know, like some samurai or something. And that ancient order has stories and traditions and practices. So we can remain true to our ancient order whilst we're busy in the world doing the things that we're doing in the world, but always having our eye to the world, our ear to the world, to hear what God is telling us from the world back to us, I think.
Thank you so much. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for if we're going to end promptly at 12 o'clock. I would encourage people to carry on having these conversations with each other and in their local churches. You can watch this webinar again, as I say, when we've uploaded it to the Well Learning Hub YouTube channel, which we'll be doing quite quickly. And you can also watch all the other webinars that we've already presented, and they'll be up there as well as recordings. When we do post it on YouTube as well, we'll put as many links to resources and Bible references and all those kind of things so that you can kind of find those quite easily. There is the next webinar that's coming up is on prayer and the Methodist way of life, which will take place on Friday the 13th of November. You can register for that by going to methodist.org.uk/well events and clicking on the online events button. For those of you who are signed up as 3Generate 365 group leaders, there will be a chance to talk a little bit more about this webinar as part of our leaders tune-in, which takes place next Thursday the 22nd. So hopefully some of you will be coming along to that. Just a couple of resources to highlight, and we will put a link for that into the YouTube posting. The Children, Youth and Family have a Pinterest page that contains lots of signposting to resources that help you in conversations around children's spirituality and faith formation. And there's also a creative children's ministry blog that the Well offers as well. So you can find links to that on our website, but as I say, we'll also put links to that underneath the video when it appears on YouTube. And one final thing, 3Generate 365 has a toolbox of resources that are available to group leaders, but you don't have to be a 3Generate 365 group leader to access those resources. They're available freely online. And next week we'll be publishing a session plan which is all about exploring prayer with the aim of listening to God with children and young people. So that might be a really useful resource to have a look at. Also available on the 3Generate 365 webpage is a Bible study and a little kind of questions reflection for local churches around the story of Eli and Samuel. So it might be worth having a look at that and offering it to your churches as a starting point for those conversations around children and young people as prophets. I think that's everything. Just remains to me now to thank Penny and Simon and Chrissy for all their wonderful insight and wisdom and the preparation they've put into today, and to thank you all for coming, and hope that you found it really helpful, and hope you have a great rest of the day. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Lynn. Thanks, Simon. Thanks, Chrissy.